Matthew Evans, a wealthy businessman in his late 70s, sat alone in his silver Mercedes. He tapped his finger impatiently on the steering wheel as the air conditioning barely kept up with Kentucky's scorching heat. Having retired from a successful career in finance, Matthew was accustomed to a world where everything seemed to work in his favor. But that day, he found himself stranded with a flat tire far from his luxurious mansion on the outskirts of town. He had tried calling for help, but with no signal on his phone, he had failed. Letting out a sigh filled with frustration and irritation, he realized there was nothing to do but wait. At that moment, a figure in the distance caught his attention. Approaching from down the road was a boy, around 13 or 14 years old, dressed in a faded t-shirt and worn-out shoes. The boy's purposeful stride and the way he carefully observed the car piqued Matthew's interest. "Flat tire, sir?" the boy asked in a calm, determined tone. Matthew, feeling both relieved and slightly awkward, responded, "Yes, that's right. My phone doesn't have any signal, and I haven't been able to contact anyone. I was hoping to find some help." The boy smiled warmly and said, "I can take care of it." Without hesitation, he knelt down to inspect the tire. "My grandpa taught me how to change a tire last summer. Do you have a spare?" Matthew gestured toward the trunk. The boy retrieved the necessary tools from the car and got to work. His confident hands and skilled movements displayed a maturity far beyond his years. As Matthew stood aside, watching the young boy work, he felt a wave of humility he hadn't experienced in a long time. In just a few minutes, the tire was replaced. The boy wiped his hands on his pants and said with a satisfied expression, "All done." Matthew pulled out his wallet and offered a few banknotes. "This is for you. You've been a great help, thank you," he said sincerely. However, the boy shook his head slightly and politely declined. "Thank you, sir, but I don't need it. I just like helping," he said with a kind smile. Matthew stood there, stunned, watching the boy walk away. The boy's self-assured steps and generous spirit left an impression on his mind. As Matthew returned to his car, he kept watching the boy's silhouette through the rearview mirror. Then, at that moment, the boy turned his head slightly and gave him a gentle smile. It was a smile that felt like the beginning of something profound. Matthew couldn't quite understand why this seemingly ordinary event had affected him so deeply. When he returned to his grand mansion, a sense of unease grew within him. As he ate his dinner, his mind was still lost in the determined steps of the young boy and the meaning behind his refusal of the money. That night, as he lay in bed, the feeling that something was missing became even more pronounced. "I need to find him," he whispered to himself. This was far beyond a simple thank you. The curiosity inside him would drive Matthew to take a very different path the next morning. The following day, Matthew woke up early, consumed by the thoughts that had taken over his mind. Skipping breakfast, he decided to return to the road in search of the boy. As he drove his Mercedes down the same path, his eyes constantly scanned the roadside. While he couldn't fully understand the reason behind this urge, he wanted to experience again the feeling Elijah had stirred in him. After a while, he stopped at a roadside gas station and began asking a few people about the boy. Describing the boy was challenging, but eventually an old man said, "I think you're talking about Elijah. He lives just outside of Harlan with his mother." "With his mother? How can I speak with him?" "I think I owe him a proper thank you," Matthew asked eagerly. "Yes, you're talking to the right person. Elijah and his mother often come here. Follow this road and you'll find their home," the man said, pointing in the direction. Excited by this information, Matthew quickly set off toward Harlan. Without pausing to admire the scenic roads, he arrived in the town and asked a few more people for guidance until he finally found Elijah's home. It was a small, worn-down but clean house. In the front yard, Elijah was busy repairing a fence, and Matthew recognized him immediately. Matthew stepped out of his car and approached carefully. When Elijah looked up and saw him, His face displayed a surprised expression. "Sir, did your tire go flat again?" he asked. Matthew smiled slightly and said, "No, this time I came just to say thank you." Elijah looked at him with a hint of curiosity. "To say thank you? You came all this way for that?" "Yes," Matthew replied. "What you did made me think. People usually expect something in return, but you were different." Elijah paused his work with the hammer and turned to face Matthew. "My grandpa always told me that helping someone in need is the right thing to do," he said simply. Matthew smiled. "Your grandpa was right," he said. "But really, this is more than just a thank you. I'm truly grateful." At that moment, Elijah's mother appeared in the doorway, greeting them with a warm smile. "Come on in. I'll make some coffee, and we can sit for a bit," she said. Matthew accepted the invitation. As he stepped inside, the warmth and simplicity of the modest home deeply moved him. Over coffee they chatted, and during the conversation, Elijah's mother looked at Matthew intently and said, "My son always loves to help others. But I think there's something Elijah hasn't told you." Matthew paused for a moment. "What hasn't he told me?" he asked, his face reflecting surprise and curiosity. The woman hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and said, "You never asked him why he helped you, did you?" Elijah's face suddenly turned serious, and he looked down at the floor. Matthew was confused. "No, I just thought he wanted to help. Was I wrong?" he asked, a slight uncertainty in his voice. Elijah raised his head and glanced at his mother before saying, "Maybe it's time." His mother nodded silently. Matthew could feel the tension in the room. "What is it time for? Why did you help me, Elijah?" he asked. Elijah took a deep breath. "I knew you would be on that road that day," he said, his voice low but clear. "And it wasn't a coincidence." Those words completely shifted the atmosphere in the room. Questions began swirling in Matthew's mind. "What do you mean?" he asked slowly. "Were you waiting for me there?" Elijah paused for a moment before breaking the silence. "Yes, my grandpa. He told me I needed to help you." Matthew's face was a mixture of surprise and curiosity. This was unlike anything he had expected. "But how? Your grandpa told you? What does this mean?" Elijah's eyes met Matthew's, and he simply said, "My grandpa is no longer with us, but I have a story I need to share with you." Matthew leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. The story that was about to be told seemed stranger than anything he had ever encountered. Elijah's mother spoke in a hushed tone, as if revealing a secret. "This isn't just a story about helping someone, Matthew. It's something much deeper and more personal." Matthew, still in disbelief, asked, "What do you mean?" But before anyone could respond, Elijah stood up and retrieved an old wooden box. From it, he took out a yellowed letter and handed it to Matthew. As Matthew took the letter, he noticed the worn edges of the paper. Written in shaky handwriting on the front were the words, "To Matthew Evans." Matthew's hands trembled. How is this possible?" he whispered. Elijah's expression had changed. He was no longer the calm young boy, but someone who held the weight of a profound secret. "The answers are in the letter, sir," Elijah said. "My grandpa only told me that I needed to deliver this to you. Now, it's your turn." Matthew slowly opened the letter. What was written inside would change his world forever. But in that moment, the silence in the room felt heavier than anything else. Matthew's eyes stayed fixed on the shaky handwriting on the envelope. "To Matthew Evans." Such simple words, yet they carried an unbearable weight. With trembling hands, he opened the envelope. The page inside was yellowed and old. Elijah and his mother watched in silence, the tension in the room growing thicker with each passing moment. Matthew, in a hushed voice, asked, "What does it say?" Elijah replied, "Read it. Only you can read it." His voice carried a mix of impatience and an odd calmness. Taking a deep breath, Matthew unfolded the paper and began to read. Dear Matthew, as I write this letter, I have never met you, but I know that our paths will cross one day. This world connects us all with a purpose. If you are reading this letter, then you already know that I am no longer in this world. But once upon a time, I made a grave mistake, and the burden of that mistake rests on your shoulders. Matthew, many years ago, I met your father. We did business together, but things went wrong. I couldn't repay my debt, and I lost his trust. It was a catastrophe for my family. Back then, I was young and proud, and instead of apologizing, I chose to run away. But now I understand that my regret left a weight on my family, a weight that has affected everyone, including you. The reason I wanted you to receive this letter is because I know that you are the only one who can lift this burden. Matthew's heart began to race. Is this about a debt? He wondered. But he kept reading. You must have felt an emptiness in your life, Matthew. That emptiness exists because of me. In this context, my grandson Elijah helping you is just the beginning of our family freeing itself from this burden. But what truly matters is that you understand what is written in this letter and confront your past. Matthew's hands trembled as he read. How can this be possible? He murmured. Elijah quietly said, Keep going. The letter concluded, Matthew, Elijah wasn't sent to you just to help. He is the messenger of a bond between our families that has been waiting to be repaired for years. Without understanding what happened in the past, you cannot find peace in the future. Now there's something you need to ask Elijah. What else did he bring you? Matthew lifted his eyes from the letter and looked at Elijah. What else? He asked, his voice faint. Elijah glanced at his mother before slowly pulling a small box from his pocket. The box was old, its patterns worn from time. As Matthew looked at it, a strange feeling stirred within him. Elijah held the box out to him. You need to open this too, he said. Matthew took the box in his hands and opened it. Inside was an old key. On the head of the key, a single letter was engraved. E. Matthew asked in astonishment, What is this key for? 6/9. Elijah's mother took a deep breath and said, That key is to a place your father entrusted to us. But that place, what you'll find there, it might change everything. Holding the key in his hand, Matthew was filled with both fear and curiosity. What kind of place, and why now? He asked. Elijah replied, I can't tell you that. But that place was left behind for you alone to discover. Matthew stared at the key. It wasn't just an object. It was the key to a secret long buried in the shadows of the past. He stood up and took a deep breath. I'll find that place, he said, and I'll face whatever this secret is. Elijah smiled. That's exactly what my grandpa wanted. As Matthew left the room, he knew this journey was only the beginning. Whatever lay behind the door that the key would open, no one could predict. But one thing was certain. This was no ordinary story. Matthew stood holding the key, lost in thought. Under the watchful gazes of Elijah and his mother, he tried to piece together what the key represented. The silence was broken by Elijah. Sir, he said softly, that key brought you this far, but what happens next is up to you. Matthew lifted his head to look at Elijah. Do you really not know what's behind the door this key unlocks? Elijah, his face carrying a mysterious expression, shook his head slowly. I know, but that knowledge wouldn't mean anything to you until you see it for yourself. Matthew was silent for a moment. Taking a deep breath, he stood up. Take me there, he said with determination. Whatever it is, I need to uncover this secret. Elijah's mother looked at Matthew's sudden resolve with a hint of hesitation. Matthew, she said, her voice low and trembling, behind that door you'll find not only the weight of the past, but also the burden of the future. Are you ready for that? Without breaking eye contact, Matthew replied, I've felt something missing my whole life. If there's anything that can fill that void, I'm ready to find out. Elijah smiled faintly. Then let's get you on your way, he said. They led Matthew outside to an old truck. Elijah got behind the wheel, and Matthew climbed into the passenger seat. Grandfather. The road led them toward the wooded outskirts of the town. As the truck moved forward, Matthew fiddled with the key in his hand, his mind swirling with fragmented images from the past. Why does this key feel so familiar, he wondered, but instead of voicing the thought, he remained silent. Eventually, the truck stopped in front of an old cabin surrounded by trees. The cabin looked like it was on the verge of collapse, but its door remained sturdy. Matthew noticed a large sign leaning above the cabin. It read, Evans and Harper, 1974. The name Harper faintly echoed in his childhood memories, his father's former business partner, but that was all he could recall. What does this mean? He murmured. As Matthew stepped out of the cabin, his face reflected both relief and a hint of sorrow. Elijah and his mother were waiting for him by the door. What did you find inside? Elijah asked with curiosity. Matthew held up a notebook. Everything about my father's past is in here, he said. He had planned to resolve his dispute with the Harper family, but he didn't have the time to see it through. Now, he's left that task to me. Elijah's mother took a deep breath and said, Your father's intentions were noble, but life doesn't always go as we plan. The information in that notebook is not just important for us, it's vital for the future of your family, too. Matthew nodded. This isn't just about settling the past, he said. I need to find a way to repay the debts my father left behind and make amends for the losses the Harper family suffered. And to do that, I need to build not just financial restitution, but trust and relationships. Elijah smiled and said, My grandpa always said that a true legacy isn't money or land. It's relationships and doing the right things. I believe you can do this. Matthew took a deep breath and looked at Elijah. I owe you and your mother something, he said. You've guided me and helped me face my past. But I need to do more than just thank you. I want this story to be not just an ending, but a new beginning. Elijah's mother smiled gently. All you need to do is take the right steps, she said. The Harper family is still in this town. You should talk to them and share the truth. Matthew nodded with determination. Yes, you're right, he said. Tomorrow, I'll go to the Harper family. I'll share this notebook with them and find a way to correct the mistakes of the past. As the sun set, Matthew got into his car. He looked back at Elijah and his mother one last time, thanking them. Thank you for finding me, he said. This has completed a piece of my life that has been missing for far too long. As Matthew drove, his mind was filled with plans for the future. He had an opportunity to right his father's wrongs, rebuild the Harper family's trust, and touch the lives of people like Elijah. This journey wasn't just about his own past. It was a chance to bring healing to others as well. Matthew fixed his eyes on the horizon. I will complete this story, he whispered. But alongside his determination, there was a lingering unease. He didn't know how the Harper family would react to events from so many years ago. Still, he was ready to face whatever came his way to do what was right. Early the next morning, he set off for the Harper family's home. When he reached the old but well-maintained farmhouse on the other side of town, the mixture of excitement and fear in his heart grew stronger. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the door. An elderly man answered, his face lined with the marks of time, but his eyes still sharp and curious. Yes? The man asked, studying Matthew. Mr. Harper, Matthew said. My name is Matthew Evans. My father was John Evans. I need to speak with you about something. The man paused upon hearing Matthew's name. His expression softened, though a shadow passed over his eyes. John Evans's son? He asked. Yes, Matthew replied. And I've come to make amends for a mistake my father made in the past. Mr. Harper looked carefully at Matthew before opening the door wider and inviting him in. Mr. Harper looked carefully at the notebook before saying, This might
It's
be
taken
a
a long
conversation
time to
I've
have
been
this
waiting for
conversation,
a long time.
but I can see that your father's
As Matthew
intentions
stepped
were
into the
good.
warm and simple
I never
living room
knew
of
he
the
wanted
Harper
to make
home,
amends for
he
what
felt
he
a
had
sense
done
of
to our
calm.
family.
He placed the
Matthew
notebook on the
replied
table
earnestly,
and turned to Mr. Harper.
"This is important not
This
just for your
notebook
family,
contains
but
all
for
the
mine as
details
well.
about my father's
I want to
dealings and
honor the
intentions
legacy
with the
my
Harper
father
family,"
left
he said.
behind.
My father had planned to
Mr. Harper
repay
took
his
a deep
debt to
breath
you
and said,
and make amends for
"Then
what
we'll
was
work
lost.
on this together.
But life didn't give him
But
the
you
chance.
should know, it's
Now
not
I want
something
to
that
take
can be
on that
fixed with money
responsibility.
alone. Rebuilding lost trust takes time." Matthew nodded. "I understand," he said, "but I'm ready." By the end of the day, Matthew was met with a warm acceptance from the Harper family. It was the beginning of a journey to overcome past mistakes. As he returned to his car, he felt that this journey wasn't just about opening one door, it was about unlocking a new future. He fixed his eyes on the horizon ahead and felt more determined than ever.